right. Hi, everybody. We're going to start up. So thanks for your patience. Thanks for coming tonight. For those who don't know me, I'm Eric Hoff, adjunct professor at USC School of Architecture. And I have the distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Dr. Ian Bogost. Ian Bogost is Barbara and David Thomas, distinguished professor in arts and sciences, professor of computer science and engineering, and director of film and media studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Author of 10 books, he's a contributing writer and editor for the Atlantic magazine. Bogost is also an award-winning game designer, perhaps most notoriously of Couch Clicker, a Facebook game, and Game Send-Up of Facebook games, and is founding partner of Persuasive Games, LLC. He is also a Trojan. Ian is perhaps best known to those in the environmental design fields through his books, Play Anything and Alien Phenomenology. Each has resonance to those who design, who conjure the new. Alien Phenomenology called for the recognition of the alien status of all things to us, which can allow underconsidered factors and influences to assert themselves with new importance in our work, increasing the diversity and robustness of what we do. Play Anything suggests that anything can be turned into a game if one acknowledges the boundaries and contents of a positive playground, where boredom, repetition, and an acceptance of constraints are not negatives or restrictions, but providers of frameworks for action, discovery, and potential. Leveraging the armature of rules, both external and self-created, as one engages in meaningful responses, as well as capitalizing on the looseness and play in that structure, yields a path to progress and maybe even fun. But these are just a couple examples of Ian's wide-ranging cultural production and his interest in things on their own terms. Practicing what he preaches, he's written on topics as diverse as the electronic geometry of tube TVs and its effect on game worlds, how to reconcile differing paradigms for communicating meaning in alien languages, exhaustive inventories of the products at Walmart, how any graphic message looks more appealing when placed between sandwich buns, and yes, buildings. So please join me in welcoming Ian Bogost to the USC School of Architecture.
I'm going to see it with my I've heard that it's very tenuous up here. I should be quite careful. So I'm going to get the Face ID to work. Just look directly at your device in order to unlock it. Okay, I'm really excited to be here. Not just because I'm excited to be here, because it all looked like I wasn't going to make it today. I was in an airplane like an hour ago, and now I'm here, which is thrilling. I'm just riding the waves of the adrenaline that somehow got me to you this evening. Okay, so let's now it's our chance to see if this is really going to work. My experiment, manipulating your technology. Okay, perfect. That's my box. I recognize my material. This is the title for the talk today. Think inside the box. It's probably not what you think, but it maybe is a little bit what you think. Here we go. A little over, when I counted, it was disturbing. A little over 25 years ago, I somehow weaseled my way into the technology and entertainment industries here in LA while I was still an undergraduate here at USC. When I was here, Levy Library had just opened, and this was sort of like really one of the first buildings in the university's still ongoing Tuscan theme park architectural era. It had just opened, and it was gotta get that right. It was meant to be a library. This is what they sold us at the time. It was going to be a bookless library, a library of computers. And then like on day one, they had books back in it. These are actual photos of the interior of Levy Library circa 1994 or so. And in those bowels of the library, I don't know what's there anymore, but on this giant, expensive Sun Spark stations that they put down there, where the internet was available to us kind of for the first time. On one of those machines, I loaded up a website called Yahoo, which was still being hosted at the time from a server at Stanford. Just a few years later, Yahoo would be worth over $100 billion. And then a few years after that, around 95% less than that. And so it was pretty tempting to try to cut yourself in. And I cut myself in on a piece of that action and on the 95% losses as well. And one of the things I did at the time, among other things, was I was a member of the team that built the first version of Lexus.com, which really did look like this kind of Tuscan theme park in a way. And it was so weird, like the web was still very spatialized back then, and we had these places and point. It was very strange. And that little dude, Alex, a little concierge, he really did walk out to greet you on the web page. It was this little animated GIF. It was a massive bandwidth indulgence at the time. And one of the things that we did on Lexus.com back in the day was we put up this golfing game. And I guess the idea was that people who bought sort of nondescript luxury cars probably like golf, because golf is also nondescript and requires wealth. And it was just an example anyway of this thing that would become known as adver games soon after. Lots of, you can buy like, checks, adver games, go back and look at the history of games. These things have been around for a long time. And that wasn't super interesting, but it was intriguing to me. That idea that games could they could sway opinion. It gave me this notion in my head that, well, if we can use them for like golf on Lexus, then maybe games and simulations have a life to lead as persuasive tools in business and in education and in politics and other domains. And that wasn't exactly a new idea either. I played SimCity as a kid. And Oregon Trail and those sorts of games. But at this point, at this moment in time, games meant something more like Doom and like Super Mario 64. So we were in this kind of strange in-between moment with respect to games. And they were growing up, but they also weren't. So some years later, I started Persuasive Games, the studio, to make games such as the ones that I imagined. And we made lots of games about lots of weird things, airport security and workers' rights and port reform and fast food restaurant operations and hotel management. We even made a game about pandemic flu at one point, which sometimes people email me and ask about why they can't play anymore. It's like, well, sorry. And then I wrote a book that shared its name with the studio, kind of a design philosophy of the work about the idea that games could make arguments. And they could do this by presenting these sort of playable models of how the world was like sort of messing around with this like pretend world that was trying to depict some idea. And as I've already indicated, this was like kind of a long time ago. It was that idea of using games in this way at scale. We were working on it at the studio, and I was working on it in my research well before like smartphones and social media and all the rest popularized. If you are an undergraduate student in the room today, all of this may have happened before you were even born, which is an extremely disturbing thought for me, at least. But anyway, I had this belief that these smart, thinky games, that they could become this sort of major form of human interchange. And at the zenith of this ambition, when I was promoting the first official video game for a US presidential candidate, which was a calling card of ours for a while, this news outlet, this sort of major national news outlet interviewed me, and I told them that like, come the next election cycle, every major candidate for president would have their own like PlayStation game that would outline their platform, that would give you this experience of what it would feel like to live in America under the policies that they were proposing. And that like really seriously did not happen. Instead, they all got Facebook pages and YouTube channels, and you kind of know how the rest turned out in terms of politics, which is not super well. And games like the ones that I was making, those have persisted to some extent, but mostly as curiosities. And I talk about this quite a bit, and I'm not going to talk about it much today, but basically it's like, oh, weird, a game about tort reform or whatever, and then you can move on with your life after you've pointed it out. So that like success or failure or failed success or whatever you want to call it, led me to ask new questions about my work. I had been looking at games seriousness as a function of their content and their purpose of what they were about, really. Even if that aboutness was carried out in a new way, like by making a model rather than using images or making a verbal argument. And then I started to worry, well, what if that was just totally wrong? What if I had been completely off base? Or what if I was off base for the new time that we were in? What if the power of games actually came from something like their nature rather than their content or their form? And that's when I started thinking about play more seriously. And play, it's something that you do with games, but it's shared by many other activities and devices and apparatuses. Everything from guitars to steering wheels has play, or you play with. And then I wrote this book, Play Anything, in which I argued that anything was playable, basically, and that anything had the power to bear some of the same meaning and delight that we found in games and toys and other kinds of objects that we were used to finding meaning and delight in. And the trick I argued in this book came from externalizing the joy of play to the object, rather than thinking that it comes from you, the subject. It's all about kind of deliberately working the materials of this world and by respecting and acknowledging and respecting their constraints. And this did okay, but it's also I've run into my own technological barrier. There we go. I was trying to help people with this book, really help people, not just kind of do thinky work or academic work or even design work. And it's really hard to write a self-help book, if that's what you want to call it, because what people actually want out of something like that is an answer, a simple answer, maybe something more like how to live playfully, the 7 proven steps to success in work, love, family, and everything, which is a book that probably would have sold a lot more books, and my wife and my literary agent would be happier about than the one that I did write. And I've struggled with this too. It's well, just please tell me what to do. It's kind of what people want to know. And it's also not unreasonable, because good advice is advice that you can follow. And I've been struggling with this question since I wrote this book, in the same way that I was struggling with the last question since I wrote Persuasive Games. Even as I tried to make it a real and actual part of my own daily life and my own professional life, and my professional life as an educator and a manager and a journalist and a designer and all the other hats that I seem to wear. But it's still really difficult to do. It's one thing to theorize about play philosophically, or even to design for it, and it's quite another to put a play into practice. So I might not end up telling you how to do that today, but at least I'm hoping you'll walk out with a sense of how to not do it entirely poorly, if that's a promise I can make good on. So let's start by playing a little game. It's a really simple game. I want you to consider this grid, this arrangement of 9 dots in a 3x3 grid. In the game, the challenge is I want you to think about how you might connect all of those dots with a finger or a pencil or a pen, maybe something like this. And there's lots of other ways to do that. So you can think of some on your own. But it's also not terribly exciting to do. This isn't the kind of activity you're going to run home after the lecture. I learned this amazingly the game. I learned it was totally worth staying up for the talk. So that's a fair point. Well, let's kind of back up and try to dig into how to approach games and play, even simple or stupid games like this. So one of the problems is that people normally think of play as an activity that people perform. And I don't think that's right. I think it's more useful to think of it as a condition of things. It's like a state of the world. And another thing that people often think is that play is it's just not work. It's the opposite of work. But that's also wrong, because play is a kind of work. It's just not the kind of work that you do at a job, right? The kind of work we think of when we say the word work. It's work like you're working something, like you're kneading dough. It's a name for deliberately operating. So if you think about these words, you might be if you do carpentry, you might call yourself a woodworker because you work wood, right? Or if you go out clubbing, You might talk about, maybe this is old fashioned, like working the floor like a dancer does. And that's what I mean by working. And if you start to see things that way, then anything can be kind of used in this manner, which doesn't mean that like everything that you do, all situations you're in, are of equal interest or delight or value, but just that for everything that's out there, there's probably something more to it. There's something that you haven't seen before in it, something you've overlooked, something deeper than you've acknowledged. Play is also paradoxical. It produces this feeling of freedom, but it doesn't do that by giving you freedom. It does it by taking away freedom, by reducing rather than expanding possibilities. If you go back to the guitar doesn't like produce music when you're just like, oh, the guitar, like do whatever you want, like have at it. That's how most of us feel who don't know how to play the guitar. Rather, it produces something delightful when you do a very particular thing with it. In the case of the guitar, when you hold its fretboard and strum its strings in accordance with the patterns that we call chords. So if you take some of these ideas in your head and you go back to this dot game, let's think about it again, but let's invent some new rules or restrictions. So I want you to think about how you might connect the dots, but this time I want you to do it without lifting your pen or pencil or finger from the paper. And if you do it that way, then some of the solutions that we previously didn't even talk about because they weren't interesting are eliminated. And then others are made possible anew. So that's kind of what I mean by a paradox. By reducing your options, the activity becomes more rather than less interesting. And weirdly, the more of these constraints you apply, the better it seems to get in most cases, the more it amplifies that feeling. So what if you like can't cross a previous stroke? That would be another restriction you could apply. And working the game under these conditions is harder and more interesting than it was just a moment ago. Okay, let's start again. Same deal, connect the dots, but this time the restriction, the constraint is don't remove your pen from the paper, and then do it in the fewest number of lines possible, okay? So there's an option, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. That's interesting. I also like the sort of pattern of it. Here's another one. It's still 5. This one crosses its lines, which I didn't impose as a restriction. We could adopt or not. That it's still 5 lines. So I wonder, like, if we can do it in fewer. Now, this puzzle or versions of it have been around for a long time. I didn't just make this up. One version of it, the one that I know best, appeared in 1914 in a book called Sam Lloyd's Cyclopedia of 5,000 Puzzles, Tricks, and Conundrums, which is the delightful kind of name you can't use anymore, except if you're like opening a gastro club or something, and then you can use it. But there's evidence that these kinds of puzzles, variants on it, existed for a long time before, just like word squares were found in the ruins of Pompeii and so on. But this puzzle, this thing that I'm going to call the dot puzzle, it remained pretty esoteric until the 1970s, when this guy, it's a psychologist named J.P. Guilford, started using it as a study in psychometric experiments of human intelligence and creativity. And the context here is relevant. Namely, in the 2 decades prior to this, which is really when the behavioral sciences and in particular psychology were very much on the rise, Guilford had developed this theory, and he called this theory structure of intellect, or SI. Back in the 50s, if you had a 2-letter acronym instead of a 3-letter acronym, it was called SI. So if you're ever writing period dramas about 1950s experimentation, two letters, not 3. So there's a free takeaway. So SI articulated this 3-dimensional model of human intelligence, and there were 3 categories of mental abilities. Those included operations, which is like processes such as recall or comprehension, and contents, which were areas of intellectual activity, like being able to manipulate symbols. And then there were these things called products, which is this kind of like quasi-algebraic process of applying an application, a specific operation in particular context. And you can read more about this later if you're interested. But Guilford was particularly concerned with an idea that had emerged from this line of study, which was called divergent production. And this was meant to be a kind of response to problem solving that he saw as unlocking the door. This was the key to unlocking creative thinking. And Guilford, according to Guilford, convergent production That kind of thinking is good for arriving at singular answers. Answers like, well, how many dots are in this grid? Like we kind of want everybody to come up with the same answer. Otherwise, we no longer live in a community, which is, by the way, exactly what's happened on the internet for the last 10 or 15 years. So I don't know what to make of that. Even have to deal with the internet. And then there's divergent production, which is used for generating multiple answers. And an example that Guilford uses for divergent production is what are all the possible uses of a brick? And that's actually a subject that he took up in a study once. And you could think of, like how you might connect the dots in this grid with fewer than 5 lines as another way to assess divergent production. Now, if you've been around the block a little bit, you may already know this puzzle or game. You've probably seen it before because Guilford and others who used it in these studies accidentally made it very famous. So if you want to connect the dots in fewer than 5 lines without lifting your pen, there's the answer or an answer. And once you see it, it's kind of an obvious answer, but very few of the subjects in any of the studies that have ever been performed on the 9-dot problem managed to find it. The idea that you would draw lines outside of the boundary created by the grid of dots, it just doesn't occur to people unless it's already occurred to them. It's almost like they just can't think outside the box, which isn't a phrase that is connected to the dot puzzle at all. And in fact, nobody really knows where this dumb phrase comes from, but it became an instant hit once it took off, not among behavioral scientists in particular. They always refer to this puzzle as the 9-dot problem, but largely in the business world, they're the ones who became obsessed with thinking outside the box. Marketers, management consultants, executive coaches. This spread from there to engineering, and then even spread back to psychology from there. And you can kind of understand why it was so seductive and why the 9-dot problem was so useful as an example of its seduction. Because Guilford and others who used this puzzle and others like it, they turned this kind of like murky abstraction of creativity, this thing all of us are trying to capture in our personal and professional lives, they turned it into a mental capacity, and one that might be testable by simple measures, such as the 9-dot problem, which was something that the psychologists were obsessed with at the time. And so thinking outside the box became like this way, this shorthand for giving shape to this otherwise elusive idea, namely what human creativity even is, how to measure it, how to capture it. It didn't hurt, I think, that the test itself became something of an object lesson for its own success. I mean, there's like what better way to prove your mettle as a creative thinker working with the 9-dot problem than to play a trump card on it? Like, 4 lines is kind of for amateurs, right? Isn't it? There's a solution in 3 lines. There's some like kind of strange adeptness to this, like by barely touching the edges of the dots with your line, almost like a tennis ball grazing the baseline. It makes this dot connector feel like almost like this sort of renegade virtuoso of dot connection. Like you can read that into this example, but you can take it, like how far can you take it? As far as you want. A 9-dot problem solved by 1 line would be far more creative than one solved by 3, wouldn't it? All right, fine. If you put the dots on a sphere, then you can draw 1 single line connecting them. And once you do that, you realize that if the sphere is the Earth itself, then you can figuratively conquer it with your literal creativity. And here we start to get into sort of self-parody, right? Like as good old Joe Jack Wallace says, an advocate of thinking outside the box, what is the purpose of thinking outside the box if you lack the courage to live outside the box? It really makes you think. More recent, so this continued. I'm not just making up stories here. More recently, outside the box attitude became a rationale for measuring creative promise in the technology industry, especially in job interviews, especially these big tech firms such as Google and Microsoft. And they would do things like ask prospective employees about like a Russian gangster's partially loaded revolver and how you know if it would kill you, or how many golf balls would fit in a 747. And these questions are supposed to measure your capacity to think your way out of a bind or to come up with novel solutions, or at least to give the interviewer a sense of how you might do so. But actually, like thinking outside the box in this way, it turns out to be a pretty terrible way to account for creativity. Participants in subsequent studies following Guilford and others who conducted them, they couldn't solve the 9-dot problem until the researchers basically told them the answer. For example, by providing like guide dots outside of the main grid, or like a starting point from where to begin. They really had to hold their hand. They had to walk them all the way to water. And this would almost completely neuter the supposed purpose of the test. And others, even if they haven't been persuaded in this way, have caught on too. Google and their ilk have basically given up on questions like the golf ball riddle because they realized that it mostly wrote them a blank check to exalt whatever answer confirmed their prior sensibilities or their unconscious biases, which is exactly the opposite of trying to get people to think creatively. And then we kind of went in the opposite direction. It became better just to engineer the best box possible. So like, for example, if you ask ChatGPT, which is this new AI answering machine you may have seen, how many golf balls a 747 can hold, it doesn't really try to get clever with you. It just gives you the most uncreative answer possible, which is the actual numerical one, which actually it gets massively wrong by about a factor of 7. So I don't know if that counts as creativity or not. The problem with the dot problem is that it's completely divorced from context. But instead of like lamenting that condition, what the evaluator does is judges your performance based on whether you were able to guess some context that they had already thought of. And if we go back to Guilford, this isn't his fault. I mean, it wasn't what he or his successors had in mind at all. Divergent intelligence wasn't supposed to be like getting the joke right, or like playing a fast one on someone, or living inside a GRE exam or something. It was supposed to be about finding approaches to new problems. In fact, as Guilford himself wrote of this back in 1957, actually, we can hardly say there is a problem unless the situation presents the necessity for new production of some kind. And the brick, Guilford's brick from the experiment that he conducted trying to find alternative uses for it, like this is a much better example of a way to explore creative thinking than the dot problem ever was. Like, just think about like a brick as a building material, and to be asked to elaborate new uses of the brick reasonably assumes that you know some of the properties of a brick. You've seen a brick, you've encountered a brick before, you know what a brick is and does, you know that it's heavy or rectangular or hard or earthen. And by virtue of those features, which you and I share an experience of, you know that it can become like a doorstop or a domino or a deadly weapon or a luxury good that can be bought and traded for its uselessness, or even a speculative financial instrument if you manage to get your hands on one of the Supreme bricks a while back. So if you return to the dot game and our interpretation of it, in which I had you like imagine that just drawing the line between the dots and just that was it, like the very first time we saw it, then we took the step back, that was boring and stupid, and that's why we had to go add all these constraints to it. But it might not be boring and stupid, because you can imagine other contexts in which it just isn't. Like, what if you're on a conference call or a Zoom, or maybe your like least interesting extended family member has telephoned you, and you're like, oh, and as you're participating in the call or whatever, you sort of doodle on paper, drawing sets of 9 dots in 3x3 grids in your quad rule notebook, and then you connect them each in a new way. And when you do that, your rationale for performing all of us have done this, right? When you carry out that activity, you're not trying to solve a problem or propose a clever alternative. You're just looking for a way to fill the empty time with something mildly diverting, so that at the end of it, you can look back on the sheet of dots and say, well, I got something out of the phone call. When I talk about play, I often tell this story, which I told in the Play Anything book, about this game that my then young daughter once invented. She was about 4 years old, and I had dragged her to this crowded mall during the holiday rush, and I was trying to get some errand done and leave, and she had this like completely different experience of me, and I was tugging her through the crowds by the hand, and as she was being pulled by me, through the errand and through the mall, she was trying to make her feet her footfalls land between the grout lines of the square ceramic floor tiles in the wall. It turned into this kind of like vertiginous carnival ride interpretation of like the old Victorian step on a crack superstition, which she didn't even know, she wasn't even familiar with, but it sort of rediscovered unprompted just by responding to the world that she found before her. And if you think about an example like this, it might be tempted to interpret it as a sort of think outside the box moment. Like, isn't this exactly what Guilford means by divergent production? That, you know, this sort of early sign of her budding creative intelligence, that, you know, maybe a signal of later capacities that will fulfill the sails of her future enterprise. But no, it really isn't that. And it's not that, because people treat creativity as this perversion of what it really is. They treat it as a natural idea that's obvious, but it too was invented like every other idea. Thanks to behavioral scientists such as Guilford, creativity came to be understood as a process of exercising personal capacity or natural ability against received expectations. And in that mindset, like being creative or failing to be creative, that became a trait of you, of the self. And therefore it became something that you either have or you lack or that you seek out or want to develop. But creativity started life on very different terms, and actually much more recently than you might realize. A philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead completely invented from whole cloth this word creativity in the 1920s. And he coined it for the purposes of his universe of philosophical study, which is called metaphysics, the study of existence. And the problem that Whitehead was facing was that, in his mind, both for philosophers and for scientists, which had very different station in the moment, they had trouble accounting for how new things arise in the world, whether those things are like, you know, natural or conceptual or material. How does something new even happen? Creativity was his invented, then new word to name this process. And that still may sound like pretty familiar or comfortable to you, something that bears great similarity to the idea that you might use every day and I think about. You know, like imagination or mustering imagination that might be capable of producing original ideas, whether that's by humankind or by nature or by God or by accident or whatever. But if we dig into it, this modern notion we have of creativity is kind of exactly backwards. Well, one interpreter of Whitehead, a sociologist called Michael Kilwood, put it like this. It's not that facts, things, or people can be placed within or draw upon creativity. Rather, it is the other way around. In other words, creativity is something that happens to you rather than because of you. Or as Whitehead himself puts it, if you want to get some Whitehead in your notebook here, creativity is always found under conditions. And those conditions are much broader and deeper than human existence alone or the current state of your mind or whatever. So just as play names a condition under which something can be manipulated for delight or for interest, creativity names the conditions under which novelty of any kind can take place. And for Whitehead, it's not a part of human experience at all. It's like this fundamental state of existence, which is what we get from metaphysicians. And if you think otherwise about it, which is what most of us have done with creativity kind of ever since, then you're getting it wrong. We might call this the creative fallacy, the tendency we have to mistake our human exertion as the central factor in creative acts rather than as a peripheral factor in those acts. Much more important than our human capacities are the materials itself, the water in which we're swimming when we conduct that human effort. You know, we're all designers in the room, and you know, like that concept also has precedent and lots of it. And the most famous one is probably the one that we get from the 19th century English designer William Morris, who has this famous quote, "There is no art without resistance in the materials." And what he means by that is that art, creativity of any kind, doesn't come wholly from within us. Instead, it's structured by things external to the things that we create, such as the physical matter out of which those things are made. Morris worked just in so many different domains of craft, and one of the reasons he was capable of thinking that way was because of this sort of high-minded, high-level way of thinking about creativity. And textiles such as wallpapers and fabrics and tapestries, which is what Morris is maybe best known for, carpeting as well, but also in many other domains, typography and bookmaking and stained glass and furniture design and lots of other domains. And his attitude toward these practices, it kind of bears a lot in common with today's fascination with the authenticity of like earnest artisanal handmade creation, the rejection of the impersonal capacities of industrial production, which was still new at the time. And that took on the name arts and crafts, under which it became a thriving international arts and design movement. And like these modern conceptions, farm to table or what have you, arts and crafts had social and political ambitions that it built from its conception of creative practice, that by focusing on traditional materials and methods, that ordinary things, the things that you encounter all the time and that go without notice, like curtains and storefronts, that those could be imbued with new delight, new pleasure, new meaning, and that would make ordinary life for everyone better in general. So like if industrialization depersonalizes people, then this arts and craft attitude might reconnect them to the objects in the built environment that previously they had been alienated from, and also the conditions and requirements needed to make them. That made arts and crafts design like simple in form, and they tended to reveal the manner in which they were created, like these naturalistic textile designs, or in architecture, arts and crafts tended to emphasize the features of ordinary materials and construction methods, like making brickwork, stone, wood, tile decorative by highlighting its physical properties rather than manipulating them into decorations themselves. And I point all these things out at some length because it also surfaces the problem with this kind of thinking. Namely, like, how would anyone ever know any of this unless they already knew it? It almost starts to look like the dot problem again. Like to understand the perspective that the arts and crafts practitioners were trying to bring, you almost have to know the answer in the first place. You have to be present for its evolution, its invention and evolution. And that gets harder and harder as time passes. When we look at sort of images of arts and crafts design, it almost just like periodizes itself away into this kind of anonymous old-fashionedness. You have to be a historian of art or architecture or design to get it, to recognize it. There's another example I want to share, which is that of the 20th century Russian composer Igor Stravinsky, who had another version of this Morris aphorism, which goes like this: human activity, this is from 1959 in a book on the metaphysics of music. Human activity must impose limits upon itself. The more art is controlled, limited, worked over, the more it is free. This is a great quote. Like, I mean, I buy it, it looks good, it sounds good, he looks very severe when I put his head next to it. Which is like this is great, but like it kind of easy for you to say, Igor Stravinsky, like what about me? What do I do with this? These kind of proverbs, they work well for accomplished creators, and when you're sort of reading along and kind of nodding sagely, because they rationalize these mysterious practices of creative success after the fact. Like if you want to be creative, just be like William Morris, just be like a creative person. You're like Stravinsky, what's the problem? Go ahead and do it. It just devolves into tautology, like the kind of TED Talk land. Creativity is the best way to be creative. If I say that in the right context, you've spent enough money to hear me say it. You're like, yeah, that's great. Let's all stand up and clap. But in reality, it's a really long road from resistance in the materials or imposed limits on yourself to like actual specific outcomes, let alone ones that we might be proud of or that might benefit one another in the world. We need some other model for this. So sometimes when I talk about this stuff, I have to introduce Charles and Ray Eames. I don't expect I have to do that in this room, but just in case, they're the 20th century husband and wife designer duo that brought us a whole range of design objects and creative works, the Eames lounge chair, the Power of 10 film, tons of other contributions to architecture, furniture, graphic design, filmmaking. And there's this terrific 1972 interview that Charles Eames did in which he was talking about how do you get out of the anxiety of creativity. And so first thing he does is he puts this idea of constraints on the board, asserting that constraints, the design depends largely on constraints. And the interviewer says, okay, well, like what constraints though? And Eames says this amazing thing in reply. He says the sum of all constraints. And then he continues with this sort of explanation. Here is one of the few effective keys to the design problem. The ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible, his willingness and enthusiasm for working within these constraints. Constraints of price, of size, of strength, of balance, of surface, of time, and so forth. Each problem has its own peculiar list. And you first read that and you think, okay, well, I mean, like, am I just not in the same place I was with William Morris? Like, this feels like great, all the constraints. That's fantastic. I will get right on that tomorrow, right away. But I actually think the advice is different and liberating too, because if you assume that the sum of all constraints is sort of this goal, like that you're working toward asymptotically, then any single constraint that you might pull out of a hat contributes to that sum. It offers some beneficial progress. It's almost like any choice is better than none because it allows the designer to make meaningful progress in some situation, or at least to see the situation from a different light. And I also think, I mean, maybe I'm pressing this too far here, but I think this Eames attitude also explains why the dot game is so irritating, because it's like, guess what I'm thinking? And if you didn't think to manipulate space outside the grid, then what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that you're like creatively inadept. It just means that the apparent materials at play for one player or user of this device were different at that moment in time from those of another, which also means that if you like successfully solve the arbitrary version of this pattern that I gave you, that doesn't mean you're thinking outside the box in any way. It just means you're thinking inside a different one. And if we go back to my daughter's little game, like, it's really tempting. This is what happened to me at the time, even to conclude, oh, like this arises, this solution to the problem of being bored and irritated in a situation you didn't choose. This arises because of some internal capacity for creative thought, or maybe differently, just because she's a child and hasn't yet been beaten down by adulthood with all the oppressive boxes we try to draw around ourselves. And I guess maybe there's some truth to that. But there's also something far simpler happening. Like, she was just playing a different game than I was. She was using the materials of our situation in a different way. And I was focused on getting this task done as efficiently as possible, which is very dot game-ish of me. And she just didn't care about the task at all. She was focused on getting through another moment on Earth around which she exerted limited control. And here it's worth like reflecting on this business of like children and play, which comes up all the time. And we think that like play is something we have and then we lose and we have to regain. And like, if kids are creative in this way, it's not because it's innate or because they see the world in a way that we then beat out of them. It's because they're constantly compromising. The world isn't really theirs, and they're adjusting to that world. They're responding to it constantly. So that restriction in her, the fact that she didn't choose the circumstance, it invited her, it kind of pushed her into a circumstance where she reframed the materials at hand. You know, the tiles that I didn't even notice became this opportunity. She was also closer to the ground, you could see them. The shopping task was just not something that she was thinking about at all. And the thing that we shared in common, which was our literal connection, the hands that we were holding, that became this sort of locomotive apparatus that drove her through the experience. And you can imagine like a different version of this situation. This is the one that you would write in your screenplay and film in a touching way before your kid runs outside and gets run over by a bus or something horrific. Like, you know, in which I had like taken her cues and followed them. And we had this delightful and touching moment where I was brought down to earth from my adult insensitivity to her creative practice. And maybe that would have been interesting. You know, it would have been a bigger and more inclusive, but mostly it just would have been a different game that we would have had the opportunity to play together. Not necessarily a better one, just a different one. So it turns out that game designers have a concept that describes all this, although I'm going to give you some revisions to the way that it's been received by game design and practice. And it starts with this guy, Johan Huizinga, a Dutch anthropologist of the early 20th century. And Huizinga did all kinds of things I don't have time to talk about today. But late in his life, as fascism was rising in Europe, he published a book called Homo Ludens, which tries to argue that play is the very center of human activity and civilization, that man is not primarily a knower, a Homo sapiens, or a creator, a Homo faber, but a player, a Homo Ludens, that's the title. And Huizinga saw play as this really serious business, this thing through which culture itself is produced, not just some kind of distraction that separates it from us. And he does all sorts of things in this book, showing how the rituals and practices of human culture, kind of all across the board, law, religion, war, politics, all of them and more rely on play as fundamentals. And this makes sense if you think about it for a minute, because like in law, there are these roles that we adopt, the role of judge or prosecutor, and they have like specific garments, almost like actors in a play. And the carriage of justice in a court is like a lot like theater. In fact, it's so much like theater that we find it interesting to watch that take place as entertainment on television. So for Huizinga, in order to work as these human like ritual practices, these domains have to separate themselves from the world. They have to draw some sort of border or boundary that can hold in the activities in question. And I'm gonna read to you a kind of long passage from Homo Ludens, because it's sort of like an establishing shot for all of game design in the contemporary sense. All play moves and has its being within a playground marked off beforehand, either materially or ideally, deliberately or as a matter of course. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice are all in form and function playgrounds, forbidden spots, isolated, hedged round, hallowed, within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. It's really lovely prose, but in the middle of this passage, there's this litany of examples that Huizinga is using to argue, to kind of articulate his argument about play as having the central role of human development. We get, the arena, the card table, and so forth. And most of them are pretty specific, these particular locations where the stakes of culture play out. So you can think about how sports and gladiatorial combat take place in an arena, or how gambling takes place on a card table, or how ritual and religion take place in temples, or how mimicry and escape and carnival take place in various kinds of contexts, stage and screen, and justice or corruption for that matter in court. But there's one of these examples that's quite a bit different, or at least different by our contemporary eyes than the other, and it's the magic circle, which actually he did mean, Huizinga meant, to have a specific cultural meaning like the others, namely the ritual space marked up by like magicians, sorcerers, or other kinds of sacred traditions. But that idea got sort of absconded with, removed from Huizinga and applied. It took on a different meaning inside a game design in a famous textbook that's widely used in this discipline, written by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman. They use magic circle as a shorthand for the special place in space and time created by it. You can see the Huizinga shining through it. That might mean like drawing the hopscotch board, or like repurposing a Scottish cliffside for a golf course, or even just adopting specific formal rules and regulations in a tabletop game. But among those in my crew, in my community, who make it, study, and play games, this term, the magic circle, it most often refers to the boundary, to the separation, that border between the ordinary world and the game world, as if we practitioners of play and game design are trying to like protect our practice. And so as a consequence of that, this concept, it's often been used to talk about the kind of ethics of playing a game. There's lots of examples of this, but just to give you like when you're playing Words with Friends, is it cheating? Does it break the magic circle, as some say, if you, when you get your turn, look up your possible plays in like an anagram solving website? Or like if you play World of Warcraft and you just go on eBay and you buy your character instead of leveling it up, what does that mean? Are you a spoil sport, or is it a valid and legitimate way of playing? And when game makers adopted the magic circle in this way, they did this verbal thing with it. In the litany of magic of hallowed places in Huizinga, it's the magic circle. but it became in game design the magic circle. That's the we call it the magic circle, as if like the emphasis is shifted from the magic that takes place inside to the boundary surrounding it. And that led to all of this like arguments that I'm not going to rehearse about like the pliability and security of the magic circle and blah, blah, blah. But in the process, there's this way of interpreting, of reading Huizinga that's been kind of underlooked or underdeveloped, which is the way that concept holds some things in while keeping others out. Like, you know, things like the arena and the court and that kind of thing, those are like somewhat permanent. But anything can be this sacred space in the way that Huizinga imagines it. And in fact, when you go and you read him, he also accounts for playgrounds that can be marked off with ideally, like as a concept, like just in your head, like when you're looking at something and when you're thinking about it. So, you know, you could replace the box with all of its like overtones of bureaucracy and power with the circle instead, if you want. Like this is just like a way of drawing some stuff together and leaving others out temporarily. It's like a means of including some things while excluding others, which is exactly what my daughter was doing. She was taking this shopping mall and taking a portion of it and kind of, you know, like conceptually bounding it. And within her little playground, within the space in which the tiles were near to her vision and her feet were important to her and the crowds were there and my momentum was pulling her, she found an activity to partake of. And then outside of that circle, everything else still persisted. It wasn't like there's the game and there's everything outside the game, right? All that stuff was still there. And it was kind of moving in and out and interfering with her game. And if I had been able to kind of get over myself and join in, then we would have drawn a different boundary in which different information, different ideas would have been present. If you kind of go back and you think about like just this one example, brief, the words with friends example. If you try to reinterpret it in that way, not as like drawing a boundary where one is cheating or not, or playing the game right or wrong, or in which there's sort of ethics or morals at play, but when you're asking, what does this thing do? What is possible within it? Then it makes sense. Because like a Scrabble style word game that you play on your phone means that it's asynchronous, that you play a turn and someone else plays a turn. And during that intervening time, you're going about your life, you're doing all your other stuff. So of course you're going to be tempted to go look up the words that you might play. Like, just embrace it. That's a different game. It's not just Scrabble where you cheat. It's Word with Friends where you don't. So just like one last thing I want to say about this passage from Homo Ludens, which is that if you look at it closely, he rolls up all of these ritual spaces all together into one kind of overarching concept, which is right here. It's this concept of playgrounds. And this word is doing a lot of things for me and for Huizinga. I really love it. Like he's absolutely invoking the sand encircled space in the park down the street with the slides and the swing sets. But that was a relatively new concept at the time. This modern notion of a playground is like a natural environment with physical, this didn't exist at all until the 19th century at the earliest, when playgrounds like these first appeared in Europe and America, and they were erected themselves for these sort of like moral reasons. Like this was a place where like manners and rules, and sports was the industrial age, right? Sportsmanship could be exercised and policed. And then at the same time, the urban landscape was changing, and the streets where children had previously played became newly feared for safety, for hooliganism, especially when a motor car appeared on the scene. And then at the same time as that was happening, there were these like deplorable conditions arising in tenements and child labor laws coming into play. And you know, by some accounts, the very idea of childhood didn't exist before or around this purpose was invented in response to these circumstances. All this is going on. But also, Huizinga, who wrote the English translation of his original, meant playground more generally, and this hyphen really helps us here. Like just anything whatsoever that can be construed as a ground for play, where play becomes possible once you take the materials at hand seriously and start using them deliberately. It's just interesting to me, this like oscillation, this tension between the seriousness of play and the childishness of it, that we still have this preconception of play as being a fantasy of recaptured childhood. If we could just like return to that innocence, then we could be happy. And it's even, I'm guilty of invoking this sentiment when I use this example of my daughters, because I'm trying to like invite you into the sort of tenderness of her former smallness, which you might remember from your own or your children's or what have you, these things that are lost in memory and feel like maybe you could reclaim. But it's much weirder and stranger than that. Even the historical playground didn't really start off as a space of freedom. It was more like a new prison to house those who had escaped from the old one. You know, it's like from the streets into the protected boundary of the park, or from the tenement to behind the tall gates of the school grounds. And no matter how delightful we reinterpret these new spaces to be, they were mostly just new spaces, not free-for-alls. They structured thinking and action differently than those that came before us. It's almost like this world that we live in is a playground full of playgrounds, not because you can do whatever you want with it, but because you can't. They're not things we create. They're more like structures that we discover or fall into, and then that we suffer under, that we tolerate and endure and then reform again. And if you look at them this way, you start to see them everywhere, kind of turning over on one another, rolling downhill like snowballs. And that tolerance for playgrounds can become liberating, but only in relation to the constrictions that form it. That's really where the creativity lies, like creativity as the exhaust of the struggle that you exert with the materials and contexts in which you find yourself, rather than the victory of the struggler over them. Creativity doesn't happen where your cleverness breaks you free from the box that imprisons you, but when you accept the imprisonment and begin the work, the hard work of understanding and figuring out what you can do under the circumstances. I think about this phrase a lot, under the circumstances. It's a line that ought to get more respect than it does. It's always used with this like tone of concession, you know, like, well, you did what you could under the circumstances. As if there is ever anything other than the circumstances. Like, which circumstances were you hoping for exactly? The ones that you imagined in your fantasy of your ideal life that you will never live? Wouldn't it be better actually to acknowledge and respond to those actual circumstances, even when seeking to improve your lot in relation to them, rather than to lament them or to reject them or to ignore them? The circumstances, it turns out, are all we ever get. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.